Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a deep dive into a whole bunch of news from Cyprus and Greece, all from late March 2025. So we've got reports from a bunch of different Cypriot and Greek news outlets, and our mission today is to try to make sense of it all. Break down the most important stuff, the political stuff, economic trends, what's happening in society, and of course the international developments, just to help you guys understand what's going on.
Yeah, we've got a really interesting mix of information here, It's like a snapshot of how this whole region is reacting to everything that's happening, both globally and, within their own borders. Let's see if we can connect some of the dots here.
Okay, so let's jump right into the international scene, which, like it has been for a while now, is really dominated by what's happening in Ukraine. And it looks like the president of Cyprus was in Paris for a pretty big four-way meeting.
Yeah, and what I find interesting about this meeting with the president of Cyprus, Macron from France, Mitsotakis, the Greek prime minister, and President Aoun from Lebanon, it's not just that it happened, but who was there. It kind of suggests some strategic thinking going on while, the headlines may focus on Ukraine in general. Having these specific leaders together hints that they might have been talking about the Eastern Mediterranean too. The Cypriot news agency, CNA, actually confirmed the meeting with this quote in Greek, "Oketi exoesto parasi tetrame sunitisi me potoro nitosti kaiudoch." Makes you think, were they trying to figure out how to keep things stable in the region with the whole Ukraine crisis as like the backdrop?
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
So maybe it wasn't just a general chat about Ukraine, but more about how what's happening over there is affecting this part of the world specifically.
Exactly.
And while we're on the topic of Ukraine, there are these reports saying that Putin, Russia's president, is suggesting a transitional government in Kyiv. That seems like a pretty big deal.
Oh, yeah, for sure. If that's really happening, it means he's trying to shape what Ukraine will look like politically, even after the fighting stops. It brings up all sorts of questions, What would the terms be? How would the world react? And ultimately, what would it mean for things settling down in the region over the long term?
And on top of that, the EU seems to be stepping up its support for Kyiv, pledging a huge 5 billion euros for weapons in Paris. That's a lot of money.
It definitely is. And it's important to see this alongside the EU's stance on sanctions against Russia. It's like a two-pronged approach. They're helping Ukraine defend itself while putting economic pressure on Russia. What I'm curious about is whether everyone in the EU feels like this is working or if there are different opinions within the EU itself.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, Greece's Prime Minister Mitsotakis also stressed something really crucial. He said there needs to be a ceasefire in Ukraine as soon as possible. Seems like everyone wants that, right?
Pretty much. When you think about the human cost of this conflict and all the disruptions it's causing economically and socially, a ceasefire just makes sense. The tough part, though, is figuring out how to make it last and how to actually address the root causes of the conflict. What would it take to create a ceasefire that actually holds up at this point?
That's the million-dollar question. And something else that's interesting, Cyprus has said it's ready to help out with security in Ukraine. CNA quoted the president saying this in Greek. Asik, masas filaya, Ukraina, efo akprovontas, etomtita pro.
Right, and that raises the question of what contribute to security means for Cyprus, given its position, geopolitically. Being a non-aligned EU member, they might focus on humanitarian aid, logistics, maybe even peacekeeping in the future, rather than sending troops or weapons. It shows they're willing to get involved internationally, even with all the stuff going on at home.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, let's talk about Turkey, another major player in the region. U.S. Senator Rubio expressed some worries about instability there, and that could have some pretty big consequences. Oh, absolutely. Rubio's statement, and I'm quoting here, "Mios sinisux I astetea statli tokaya pu eniestensens mastumachos li astupio," really highlights something important, not just for the U.S., but for everyone in the region. Turkey's a NATO member, and it's in a really strategic spot, so if things get unstable there, it could have a huge impact on security and international relations. Yeah, it's like a domino effect. Yeah. And it seems like there's some diplomatic tension brewing between Turkey and Greece right now, with reports that Turkey's foreign ministry wants Greece to explain some insulting slogans. These things can escalate pretty quickly, can't they?
They can, yeah. Even though it might seem small, these kinds of back and forths often point to deeper tensions. The content of those slogans and how Greece responds will tell us something about the state of their relationship. It's a good reminder that the region has a lot of history and competing interests that can easily flare up.
Let's switch gears again and talk about the global economy. There's a lot of buzz about potential new U.S. tariffs on imported vehicles, and that's causing some concern, even as far away as Cyprus. It's crazy how connected everything is.
It really is. The Boston Fed's warning about potential inflation from these tariffs shows just how much impact global trade policies can have. Something that seems like a U.S. issue, mainly affecting car manufacturers, can have real consequences for consumers and economies all over the world.
And it looks like the European Commission is getting ready to push back. They're talking about a strong and well-targeted response. They're not just going to sit back and watch, are they?
No way. The EU sees this as potentially hurting their own car industry, so they're not going to take it lightly. Their response is probably aimed at either getting the U.S. to back down or at lessening the impact if the tariffs do go through. It's a high-stakes game of international trade, that's for sure.
And for Cyprus, the impact sounds pretty straightforward. More expensive cars and maybe fewer options for buyers. That affects people in their daily lives.
Exactly. When tariffs make imports more expensive, those costs usually get passed down to consumers. Plus, if tariffs make some cars less competitive, manufacturers might decide to import fewer models to Cyprus. That means fewer choices for buyers and could even affect related businesses like car dealerships.
Okay, let's shift our focus to the Middle East now.
Mm.
The discussions going on between Hamas and mediators about a new ceasefire in Gaza are definitely something to keep an eye on.
Definitely. These talks are super important for trying to ease the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and de-escalate the conflict. The fact that they're still talking is a good sign, but it's not going to be easy to reach a lasting agreement. There's a lot of complexity and distrust between the two sides.
And unfortunately, even with these talks, things are still really tense. Israel is saying that rockets were launched from Lebanon and that they're going to respond strongly. Doesn't sound good.
No, it doesn't. This just shows how intertwined the conflicts in the region are. If things escalate on the Israel-Lebanon border, it could easily undo any progress made in Gaza. Israel's talk of a strong response makes you worry that the fighting could spread.
Definitely concerning.
Oh.
And to wrap up the international news, there's a summit in Paris about energy and security in the Eastern Mediterranean. With all the resources in that area, that's a big deal for Cyprus and Greece.
Absolutely. The Eastern Mediterranean has become this hub for energy exploration, and it's a place where a lot of countries are vying for influence. Having a whole summit about this just shows how important the region is strategically. And 24 News mentioned a potential four-way meeting between Cyprus, Greece, Lebanon, and even Syria. Now, that's really interesting because it hints at possible shifts in alliances or new dialogues happening in a region with a really complicated network of relationships and interests.
So much to unpack there. Okay, let's zoom in on Cyprus specifically now and look at what's happening politically and socially. We already mentioned the president's been pretty active on the international stage, especially with those meetings in Paris.
Yeah, his involvement really shows that Cyprus wants to be a key player in regional and international discussions, despite its size and the issues it's facing at home. The relationships they build and the ideas they share in these meetings can directly affect how other countries see and interact with Cyprus, especially when it comes to the Cyprus problem.
Right. And speaking of the Cyprus problem, there's some interesting reports coming out. It seems Ersin Tatar, the Turkish Cypriot leader, didn't want a UN envoy appointed during the informal Geneva conference. That kind of suggests a stalemate, or at least different ideas about how to move forward.
It does. Tatar apparently wants an envoy who agrees with his agenda, which suggests he's trying to control the narrative and the direction of any future negotiations. That kind of stance can make it harder for a neutral mediator to help the two sides make progress.
And there's talk of the Anastasiades model for a looser federation resurfacing. That's been brought up before. Why is it relevant now?
Bringing back the Anastasiades model, which basically means a less centralized federal structure, could be a way to find some middle ground, something that addresses the main disagreements between the Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot communities. And the fact that people see Nicosia's presence in the Paris discussions as bringing new perspectives suggests that international involvement might be influencing how they think about these frameworks.
Okay, so moving on to what's happening within Cyprus. The House of Representatives has been busy. They approved the FICB law, but rejected the one dealing with refugee issues. What does that split decision tell us?
These kinds of outcomes usually reflect the different priorities and political leanings within the parliament. The FICB law probably deals with financial or business regulations, and them approving it suggests there's agreement on those issues. But the rejection of the refugee law probably points to disagreements about things like asylum policies, managing migration, or maybe concerns about the strain on resources.
It's interesting how those decisions play out. On a more positive note, though, they did vote on laws to combat violence and harassment in the workplace. That's a big step towards creating a fairer society.
For sure. Having these kinds of laws shows that society is becoming more aware of these issues and that they're committed to making work environments safer and more respectful for everyone. It reflects changing social norms and a willingness to address harmful behaviors.
That's encouraging. But then there's been some criticism about cuts to photovoltaics, like solar energy in the DSMK budget. That seems kind of contradictory when everyone's talking about green energy and climate change.
It does raise some questions about the government's long-term energy plans and how committed they are to renewable energy. Cutting back on support for solar power could slow down the transition to cleaner energy and make it harder for Cyprus to reach its environmental goals. It's a choice with both economic and environmental impacts.
Yeah, definitely something to watch. Now, Cyprus is also facing a really serious water shortage. The fact that they're rushing to find desalination solutions with something like 53 proposals for floating units shows how urgent the situation is. That's a lot of proposals.
It is, and it just highlights how severe the drought is. The fact that they're comparing it to the 2008 crisis when they had to ship water in from Greece is a big warning sign. The government's definitely under pressure to find a solution fast.
And people are really worried about potential water cuts this summer. When water's scarce, it affects so much of daily life.
It does. Everything from agriculture and tourism to just basic needs at home. Not having enough water can have huge economic and social consequences. Investing in desalination is essential for making sure the island has enough water in the long term.
Now, unfortunately, there's been some troubling news in terms of crime. There was a school break-in and arson in Limassol, and a young motorcyclist was seriously hurt in a traffic accident in Larnaca. These kinds of incidents are always upsetting.
They are, and they remind us that we need to keep focusing on public safety and being responsible in our communities. Even isolated incidents like these can have a big impact on the people involved and their families.
And there was also an arrest for possession of stolen jewelry and a knife. Plus, there was a really sad story about someone who paid a whopping €12,000 to be smuggled into Cyprus illegally and then got scammed. It's a reminder of how vulnerable some people are.
These cases just show the variety of crimes the police are dealing with, from theft to human trafficking and fraud. That story about the person who got scammed is particularly heartbreaking. It highlights the risks people take when they try to enter a country illegally and the awful people who take advantage of them.
It's really unfortunate. There's also been some scrutiny of the police regarding out-of-court settlements, with Parliament looking into 2 cases involving cameras. That raises questions about transparency and how these things are handled.
Yeah, it's crucial to keep an eye on law enforcement to maintain public trust in the justice system. The fact that Parliament is investigating these cases shows that they're committed to making sure police procedures are transparent and accountable, especially when money is involved.
It's about keeping things above board. And finally, in a case that's been going on for a while, the court's expected to make a decision on April 4th about the remains of Thanasis Nicolaou. That's a case that's really stayed in the public eye.
Absolutely. It's a sensitive case with a complicated history, and people are hoping that the court decision will provide some answers and closure for the family and for everyone in Cyprus who's been following it.
Definitely a case that's touched a lot of people.
Yeah.
Now, shifting to some broader social and scientific news, it's pretty amazing to hear about the discovery of a potential new type of antibiotic that has implications that go way beyond Cyprus.
No doubt about it. This is a huge development in medical research. The problem of antibiotic-resistant bacteria is a global threat, so finding a new kind of antibiotic could be a game changer. It gives us a new weapon to fight infections and potentially save lives all over the world.
That's really good news. Back in Cyprus, there were reports of a heated discussion in Parliament's Refugee Committee about some of the president's referrals. Refugee issues are always so complicated and tend to spark a lot of debate.
They do. Whenever you talk about refugee policies, you're dealing with this mix of humanitarian responsibilities, national security concerns, and how to use limited resources. It's not surprising that there are strong opinions and heated debates as people try to figure out the best way forward.
It's such a multifaceted issue. Okay, let's move on to the Cypriot economy. The director of the Environment Department had meetings with the European Commission. That probably has to do with environmental regulations and maybe funding opportunities, right?
Most likely. It's important for Cyprus to work with the European Commission to make sure its environmental policies meet EU standards and to see if they can get funding for projects that promote sustainability and green initiatives.
It's all about collaboration. And it seems like DEFA and EAC will have to pay for the completion of the LNG terminal. That's a huge infrastructure project for Cyprus's energy future.
Yeah, finishing that liquefied natural gas terminal is crucial for Cyprus to become more energy independent and maybe even a regional energy hub. Getting the funding is a big step towards making that happen.
It's a key piece of the puzzle. We're also seeing banks starting to get involved in the stablecoin market. That's a pretty new area in finance. What does it mean that these big traditional banks are getting on board?
It shows that even the established financial institutions are starting to accept and recognize digital currencies and blockchain technology. When banks get involved in the stablecoin market, it could lead to more people using those technologies for payments and other financial services. It could even change how the whole payment system works.
So it's about adapting to the changing landscape. But there are also some concerns about how effective the new Pothinesh's law is. That's the law about declaring assets. If it doesn't work properly, it could make it harder to fight corruption.
Transparency in how people declare their assets is really important for tackling corruption and making sure public officials are accountable. The fact that there are doubts about how well this law works suggests that they need to watch carefully how it's implemented and enforced to make sure it's actually achieving its goals.
It's about making sure the system has teeth. It seems the budget for the Exoeconomo Anavethmizo Stiskatoikis 2024 scheme has already run out. That tells me there's a lot of interest in making homes more energy efficient. That's a good sign, right?
It is. It shows that people are eager to take advantage of those incentives, and it proves how effective they can be in encouraging homeowners to make energy-saving improvements. That's good for the environment and for people's wallets.
It's a win-win.
Yeah.
And there's been an extension for applications to the photovoltaic storage scheme, which is great news for people who want to use solar power with battery storage. It makes renewable energy even more practical.
Extending the deadline gives more people and businesses a chance to get involved, which will help promote the use of renewable energy and energy storage. That's essential for creating a sustainable energy future for Cyprus.
So just to touch on some other news briefly. King Charles was in the hospital for a bit. Australia announced elections. And there were those terrible fires in South Korea. And of course, we mentioned the promising news about the new antibiotics.
Right.
It's a reminder that there's a lot happening in the world.
For sure. All those headlines show the range of events shaping our world, from political changes and health issues to environmental disasters and scientific breakthroughs. It's a constant reminder that everything's connected globally.
Absolutely. And closer to home, someone in Cyprus won 100,000 euros in the Joker lottery. Congrats to them. Plus, there are local events like the Amethyst Music Festival and the opening of the Amethyst Nicosia Hotel, which add to the vibrancy of life in Cyprus. And of course, they commemorated the anniversary of March 25th, a big day in Greek history. It's important to remember what's happening locally amidst all the global events.
It is. Those local stories remind us of the culture and everyday life that carries on, even with all the big things happening around the world. They give us a sense of community and normalcy.
They ground us, in a way. So to wrap up this deep dive, we've given you a pretty comprehensive look at a region that's dealing with international crises, big domestic challenges like the water shortage and ongoing political developments, all while making progress in areas like technology and energy. It's a dynamic and ever-changing picture.
It is. And what's really striking when you look at all these seemingly unrelated news stories is how interconnected they all are. A conflict thousands of miles away can affect energy prices in Cyprus, which then impacts people's budgets. International tensions can spill over into local diplomatic relations. It shows that no region is truly isolated. The question is, what are the long-term consequences of these connections? How will Cyprus and Greece continue to adapt as the world keeps changing? Those are things to think about.
Those are great questions to ponder. It really gets you thinking about how these global forces shape our local realities. We hope you'll keep exploring these topics and maybe even think about how these developments might intersect down the line. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.